Hi there everyone, this is the second part of the 6.12 video, and let's continue on with where we were in the reading. We are reading about the election of 2000. The contest was thrown into the court system, where judges considered the candidates' competing claims about whether and how to recount the Florida ballots. Bush held a narrow lead, but Gore said Democratic votes had been miscounted. The arguments went on for weeks. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a bitterly divided 5-4 ruling, decided there was not enough time to do a thorough, constitutionally acceptable recount before the Electoral College, which officially determines the election, was scheduled to meet. So the recount stopped and Bush was declared president, with the addition of Florida giving him 5 more electoral votes than Gore. In the last recount of Florida's popular vote before the Supreme Court stepped in, Bush had less than 1,000 more votes than Gore. In the nationwide popular vote count, Gore had won about 500,000 more votes than Bush. The second George Bush was not the first president to take office without defeating his opponent in the popular vote. The same had happened to John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Benjamin Harrison. But the Supreme Court split decision gave Bush a rocky start and left the nation rolling with this controversy. Al Gore urged voters to unify behind the president-elect. Partisan rancor must be set aside, he said. It wasn't. Bush's domestic agenda. As president, one of Bush's first priorities was to pass a major tax cut, which he believed would stimulate the economy. Democrats argued that the tax cut favored the wealthiest Americans over the middle class and the poor. The bill passed, and the tax cuts, the largest since Reagan's first term, went into effect in stages. At the same time, however, government spending increased, and the budget surpluses of the late 90s gave way to deficits, driven largely by spending on two wars discussed later in this chapter. The debate over expanding Medicare. Bush called himself a compassionate conservative. He said, "It is compassionate to actively help our fellow citizens in need. It is conservative to insist on responsibility and not on results." In what he called an example of compassionate government, Bush fought for a bill to expand Medicare to include prescription drug coverage for seniors. He vigorously lobbied both Democrats and members of his own party to pass the bill, the largest extension of Medicare since its inception nearly 40 years earlier. Supporters hailed the measure as a lifeline to older Americans whose medicines had become so costly they could not afford to buy them. But the measure faced opponents on both sides of the aisle. Liberal opponents argued that the bill's greatest benefits went to drug manufacturers, insurance companies, and corporations. Conservative opponents disliked the cost, roughly $400 billion, which they predicted would increase over time to prohibitive levels. The bill became law, but barely. Although Bush, a Republican president, looked for support from a Congress with Republicans in the majority, the Medicare bill passed the House by only 5 votes. Education, no child left behind. Bush's belief in the need to insist on responsibility and results guided his education policy. His administration built on what is called the Standards Movement, an effort to raise the performance of students in American schools by setting clear academic standards and holding schools responsible for helping students meet those standards. The Standards Movement is often dated from the publication of a report titled A Nation at Risk, issued in 1983 during the Reagan administration. The report noted ways in which American students were lagging behind students in other advanced industrialized nations. Invoking Cold War anxieties, the report declared, "If an unfriendly and foreign power has attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war." After A Nation at Risk, every administration undertook measures for education reform, but none was as far-reaching as the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, co-sponsored by a bipartisan team of U.S. congressmen and signed into law by George W. Bush. The act required that the states, in order to receive federal funds for education, must set clear academic standards, annually test children on these standards, and demonstrate adequate yearly progress. Critics make various arguments against No Child Left Behind. They said, for example, the law required states to make reforms without providing sufficient funding, that standardized tests were too limited a way to gauge student performance, and that schools might focus on teaching to the test in reading and math while shortchanging studies in history, science, and the arts. The nation's report card issued by the Department of Education in 2007 reported progress in math and reading, particularly among minority students. The long-term effectiveness of No Child Left Behind remains to be seen. Divisive issues. When George W. Bush took office in early 2001, the culture wars of the 90s were far from over. Indeed, certain issues that came to the fore to the fore at the start of the 21st century seemed to widen the gap between Americans who were already starkly divided in their views on moral science, religion, and the role of government. One of these divisive issues involved a component of Bush's policy of compassionate conservatism. Bush urged increased federal funding of faith-based initiatives, community-based religious organizations that provide social services to those in need. Religious conservatives who had strongly supported Bush in the 2000 election applauded the president's support of faith-based initiatives, pointing to the experience and commitment of these organizations and their connection to local neighborhoods. Opponents argued that while religious organizations often perform valuable community service, providing them with government funding jeopardized the principle of separation of church and state. Bush also supported other causes embraced by many conservatives, including two proposed constitutional amendments. One proposed amendment would protect prayer in public schools. Another aimed to define marriage as a union between a man and a woman, thus barring states from allowing same-sex marriages. Attempts to push these amendments through to Congress failed during the Bush administration. One other controversial issue involved merging scientific research into potential uses for stem cells, which can be developed into many different types of cells in the body. Stem cells, as the National Institute of Health explains them, can serve as a sort of repair system for the body, and thus offer researchers a promising source for new medical treatments and possible cures for diseases. While medical research using adult or tissue-specific stem cells has proceeded largely without controversy, moral objections have been raised to the use of human embryonic stem cells. During his campaign for the presidency, Bush had said, "I oppose federal funding for stem cell research that involves destroying living human embryos." In taking this stand, he was aligning himself with his supporters, particularly a large body of conservative Christians who believe that human life begins at conception, as soon as an egg is fertilized, and who thus consider it wrong to destroy any human embryo. Scientists supporting embryonic stem cell research pointed out that the embryos, each a hollow microscopic ball of cells, as the NIH notes, typically 4 or 5 days old, mostly come from fertilization clinics, where the process of in vitro fertilization produces excess embryos, many which likely be discarded. These excess embryos, said the scientists, should be used for research with potentially wide-ranging medical benefits. But this argument proved unacceptable to those opposed to any procedure resulting in the destruction of a human embryo. The president, who did not use his veto power at all during the first term, vetoed a bill that would have funded broader stem cell research. Moderate Republicans joined Democrats in objecting to the president's veto, but could not muster enough votes to override it. In 2007, Bush again vetoed a measure to expand stem cell research. Many scientists were disappointed by Bush's actions, but Bush insisted such research crossed a moral boundary. Arguments over federal funding of embryonic stem cell research persist. And here's a picture of an advocate for stem cell research, looking, because one of the uses is potentially for people that are paralyzed. Executive privilege. As his administration proceeded, George W. Bush aroused high political tensions by claiming executive privilege, the notion that the president has a right to withhold certain information, especially as regards communications and conversations between the president and the White House advisors and aides. While executive privilege is not mentioned in the Constitution, the phrase was coined by Eisenhower. The idea, as one legal analyst notes, has been invoked since George Washington. President Nixon tried to invoke executive privilege to keep the Watergate tapes confidential, but the Supreme Court denied his claim that even while acknowledging that the valid need for protection of communication between high government officials and those who advise and assist them. During his administration, George W. Bush invoked executive privilege when he refused to supply documents requested by Congress relating to a controversy over whether the Justice Department acted for purely political reasons and firing several federal prosecutors. Bush also claimed executive privilege in refusing to allow current and former administration officials and aides to testify when subpoenaed by Congress. Some constitutional scholars expressed concern that Bush's interpretation of executive privilege asserted a broad view of presidential powers by allowing the executive to define the scope and limits of its own powers, thus endangering the constitutional principle of separation of powers. And we'll stop there in the reading and go back to the lesson. Make sure that you check your answers with the lesson answer key for the reading guide. And then let's continue on to complete the next activity. A disputed election. Florida is well known as a sunshine state and a vacation destination for millions of visitors each year. In 2000, the state gained national attention for something else, an election dispute that would escalate all the way up to the nation's highest court. Follow the directions to complete today's lesson. Okay. So let's look at the student guide. What are our directions? Okay, this is something then just to reflect on. Use what you know. President George W. Bush's domestic agenda was full at the beginning of his presidency. Included a major tax cut, an expansion of Medicare, the No Child Left Behind Act, faith-based initiatives, and opposition to federal funding for stem cell research. Choose one of the above you feel strongly about, are knowledgeable about, or would like to learn more about. Review a part of the chapter that deals with that topic. If necessary, do a little research to fill in any missing pieces or answer any questions about the topic you might have. Write a paragraph in History Journal that 1. Names the Bush administration domestic policy initiative you chose, briefly describe the initiative, and 3. Explain why you either would have been a supporter or critic of the initiative. And this is something for your own personal reflection. You can just do that on your own. You don't have to submit it or anything. It's just something for you to kind of learn more about and to reflect on today's lesson. And then don't forget to complete the 6.12 checkpoint at the end to get those points. And then you are done with today's lesson. Congratulations.